At 3:57 on the afternoon of March 7th, 1945, a German combat engineer named Captain Willy Bratke stood on the western approach to the Ludendorff Railroad Bridge in Remagen, Germany, staring at 600 pounds of TNT that refused to explode. He had just twisted the ignition key on the electrical detonator. He had heard the click. He had felt the current surge through the wire. But the bridge, this 800-foot steel monster spanning the Rhine River, was still standing. Through the fog rolling off the water, Bratke could see American tanks. They weren't a mile away. They weren't across a field. They were 400 yards down the road and closing fast. The lead tank was a Sherman from the 9th Armored Division, and it was moving at 18 miles per hour straight toward the only bridge across the Rhine River that hadn't been destroyed. Bratke looked at the detonator in his hand. He looked at the primer cord snaking across the deck. He looked at the demolition chambers packed into the stone tower. The math was simple. If the bridge fell, the Rhine River remained an impassable moat. The Allied advance would stall for weeks. Germany would have time to regroup, to counterattack, to survive. If the bridge stood, the war was over. Bratke twisted the key again. Nothing happened. He could hear the rumble of the Sherman's engine. He could hear American voices shouting orders. He dropped the detonator and ran toward the emergency backup system, a hand crank device connected to a secondary fuse line. But before he reached it, a Sherman tank rolled onto the western end of the bridge and stopped. The commander, a lieutenant named Karl Timmerman, stood in the turret hatch looking at the deck. The steel planks were scorched. The railings were twisted. The whole structure looked like it had been hit by an earthquake, but it was intact. Timmerman keyed his radio and said 5 words that changed the course of the war. "The bridge is still up." To understand why a railroad bridge in a small German town became the most important piece of real estate in Europe, you need to look at the map. By March of 1945, the Allies had pushed the Germans back across France, Belgium, and the Netherlands. They had liberated Paris. They had cleared the Ardennes after the Battle of the Bulge. They were sitting on the western bank of the Rhine River from Switzerland to the North Sea. The Rhine wasn't just a river. It was the defensive backbone of Germany. It was 300 yards wide in most places, too deep to ford, too fast to swim. The bridges had been systematically destroyed by German engineers following Hitler's scorched earth directive. Every railroad span, every road bridge, every crossing had been rigged with explosives weeks in advance. The German High Command knew the Allies were coming. They knew that once the Allies crossed the Rhine, there would be no natural barrier between the invasion force and Berlin. The plan was simple: blow every bridge, force the Allies to stage a massive amphibious assault like D-Day, buy time for the Wunderwaffe, the miracle weapons, the jets, and the rockets that Goebbels promised on the radio every night. The problem was that the plan required perfect execution. And in war, nothing is ever perfect. The Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen was not a strategic target. It was a railroad bridge, not a road bridge. It was narrow, designed for trains, not for Sherman tanks. It connected a small town called Remagen on the west bank to the village of Erpel on the east bank. The bridge had been built during World War I by American prisoners of war, which is an irony that was not lost on the soldiers who would eventually capture it. The structure was a double-tracked steel arch design. It was 830 feet long. The arch rose 60 feet above the water. The deck was supported by massive stone towers on both banks. These towers weren't decorative. They were fortifications. Each tower had multiple levels, gun ports, and ammunition storage. They had been designed to withstand artillery fire. Inside each tower, the Germans had installed demolition chambers. These were rectangular voids cut into the stone, packed with explosives, and sealed with steel doors. The charges in the towers were meant to sever the bridge at the foundation. If they detonated properly, the entire span would drop into the river like a guillotine blade. On top of the demolition charges, the Germans had installed primer cord along the deck and the steel support beams. This was a backup system. If the main charges failed, the primer cord would ignite and cut through the steel like a blowtorch. And if that failed, there were individual TNT packages bolted to the arch itself, enough to shatter the metalwork. The bridge had 3 separate demolition systems. It should have been impossible to capture intact. Now, if you're enjoying this story, if you want to see how this impossible moment at Remagen changed the entire endgame of World War II, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button right now. We're digging through the archives every single week to bring you these forgotten moments, the 60 seconds of chaos that shifted the course of history. And while you're at it, hit the like button. It helps us reach more people who love this kind of deep dive into the machinery and the madness of war. We've got more stories like this coming, stories about the weapons, the decisions, and the desperate moments that never made it into the textbooks. All right, back to Remagen. Captain Willy Bratke was not supposed to be in command of the bridge. He was an engineer, not a combat officer. His job was maintenance, keeping the rail line open, repairing bomb damage. But by March 7th, the German army was falling apart. Officers were deserting, units were disintegrating. The High Command was issuing contradictory orders. Bratke had been handed responsibility for the bridge 48 hours earlier, when the previous commander disappeared. He was given 120 men, most of them overage conscripts and teenage Volkssturm militia. He was given a crate of Panzerfaust anti-tank rockets and a promise that reinforcements were coming. The reinforcements never arrived. What did arrive was a flood of refugees. By the morning of March 7th, the road leading into Remagen was clogged with German civilians fleeing the American advance. There were farm carts, bicycles, women carrying children, old men pushing wheelbarrows loaded with furniture. The Wehrmacht was mixed in with the refugees. These weren't combat units. These were stragglers, broken remnants of divisions that had been shattered in the Ardennes. They were walking wounded, men without rifles, men without boots. Bratke tried to organize a defense. He positioned his men in the stone towers. He set up machine gun nests on the eastern bank. He tested the demolition charges. Everything checked out. The electrical system was functional. The backup hand crank was operational. He had 3 separate methods to destroy the bridge, and he had explicit orders from Field Marshal Model to blow the bridge the moment the Americans appeared. But Bratke had a problem. The road was still full of German soldiers. If he detonated the charges while his own men were on the bridge, he would be committing mass murder. He made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his life. He waited. The American unit approaching Remagen was Combat Command B of the 9th Armored Division. They weren't supposed to be at Remagen. Their orders were to advance south toward Koblenz. But the commanding officer, Brigadier General William Hoge, had received intelligence that morning about a bridge that might still be standing. It was a rumor. A reconnaissance plane had spotted the Ludendorff Bridge intact through a gap in the clouds. Hoge made a command decision. He diverted his column toward Remagen. If the bridge was there, if it was intact, it was worth the risk. The lead element was a task force built around tanks and infantry. The tanks were M4 Shermans, 30-ton steel boxes with 75mm guns. The infantry were riding on the tanks, clinging to the engine deck, or following on foot. They had been fighting continuously for weeks. They were exhausted, low on ammunition, and expecting to spend the next month preparing for a massive river crossing operation. When the column crested the hill overlooking Remagen at 3:30 in the afternoon, the crews saw the bridge. It was sitting there, spanning the Rhine, intact. The first reaction wasn't excitement, it was confusion. Every other bridge had been destroyed days in advance. Seeing an intact bridge was like finding a tiger that forgot to attack. The Sherman commanders halted their tanks and radioed back to headquarters. General Hoge was at the forward command post 2 miles back. When he heard the report, he didn't celebrate. He gave a simple order: take the bridge, capture it before the Germans realize what's happening. The lead company commander was Lieutenant Karl Timmerman. He was 22 years old. He had been in combat since Normandy. He knew what a blown bridge looked like, and he knew that the Germans had to be preparing to demolish this one. He gave his platoon leaders their orders. Move fast, don't stop, get across before they can blow it. Timmerman's company rolled down the hill into Remagen at 3:45. The town was chaos. There were German soldiers everywhere, running, shooting, trying to find cover. The Shermans opened fire with their machine guns, raking the streets, suppressing any resistance. The infantry dismounted and began clearing buildings. The objective was the western approach to the bridge, a stone causeway that led to the towers. As the Americans pushed into the town, Captain Bratje was on the bridge deck, watching the disaster unfold. His machine gunners were firing at the Shermans, but .30 caliber bullets don't stop a tank. His Panzerfaust teams tried to set up ambush positions, but they were untrained teenagers who panicked under fire. The causeway was clogged with retreating German soldiers, and Bratje realized he was out of time. He ran to the detonation point in the western tower. There were 3 systems. First, the electrical detonator. It was a simple device, a key switch connected to a battery that sent current through insulated wire to the blasting caps in the demolition chambers. Bratje turned the key. He felt the click. He heard the circuit engage. Nothing happened. The bridge stood. He tried again. Still nothing. He could hear American voices outside the tower. He could hear the clang of boots on steel. He abandoned the electrical system and ran to the backup. This was a hand-crank generator. You turned the handle like starting an old car, and it generated enough current to fire the caps. Bratje grabbed the handle and cranked. The generator whined. The needle on the voltage meter climbed. He reached ignition voltage and stopped. There was a pause, a half-second of silence, and then a detonation. But it wasn't the main charges, it was the primer cord. The TNT packages on the western side of the bridge exploded. The blast tore through the steel decking. Smoke and debris erupted into the air. The concussion knocked Bratje off his feet. When the smoke cleared, he looked at the bridge. It was damaged. The decking was twisted. The railings were gone. But the structure was still standing. The main charges in the towers had not detonated. Lieutenant Timmerman was 200 yards from the bridge when he heard the explosion. He saw the smoke. He saw debris raining into the river. His first thought was that he was too late. The bridge was gone. But then the smoke cleared, and he saw the arch. It was intact. The roadbed was damaged, but the bridge was still there. Timmerman keyed his radio. He reported to General Hoge. They tried to blow it. It's still up. Request permission to cross. There was a pause on the radio. Crossing an intact bridge that the Germans were actively trying to destroy was suicide. The enemy still controlled the eastern bank. They still had artillery. They could have anti-tank guns zeroed on the far end. And the bridge itself was a death trap. The Germans might have time-delayed charges. They might detonate a second blast the moment American troops were halfway across. But General Hoge didn't hesitate. He had been an engineer before the war. He understood the value of a bridge. He gave the order: take it, get across, hold the bridgehead. Timmerman turned to his platoon leaders. He didn't give a speech. He didn't talk about glory or medals. He said, "Follow me," and started walking toward the bridge. The first man onto the bridge deck was Sergeant Alex Drabik. He was a 23-year-old from Ohio, a squad leader in A Company. He was carrying an M1 Garand rifle, 2 bandoliers of ammunition, and 4 hand grenades. He was not carrying heroic thoughts. He was carrying the knowledge that stepping onto that bridge meant entering a shooting gallery where the Germans had every advantage. The deck was a mess. The explosion had torn holes through the steel planks. You could see the river below, brown water moving fast, 300 yards wide. The guardrails were gone. The walkway was narrow, barely wide enough for 2 men side by side. Drabik started running. Behind him, the rest of the platoon followed. They were sprinting across 800 feet of open steel while German machine gunners in the eastern tower opened fire. Bullets sparked off the metal. They ricocheted, whining through the air like angry hornets. One soldier was hit in the leg. He stumbled, caught himself, kept running. Another was hit in the shoulder. He dropped, rolled to the side, and crawled toward cover behind a damaged girder. Drabik didn't stop. He didn't look back. He ran straight down the center of the bridge. The Germans weren't just using machine guns. They were firing mortars. The rounds were landing in the river, throwing up geysers of water. They were hitting the deck, blasting holes through the steel. Drabik could feel the bridge shaking under his feet. He could hear the groan of the metal, the stress of the damaged structure. Halfway across, he passed a crater where the primer cord had detonated. The hole was 6 feet wide. The edges were jagged, still glowing red hot. Drabik jumped. He cleared the gap, landed hard, kept running. Behind him, more infantry were crossing. They were moving in short sprints, diving for cover behind girders, firing back at the German positions. The Shermans were on the western end, providing suppressing fire, hammering the eastern tower with 75-millimeter rounds. Inside the eastern tower, Captain Bradge was screaming orders. He had lost the western tower when the Americans overran it. He had lost the detonator. His only option was to destroy the bridge from the eastern side. He sent a runner to the second demolition point. This was another hand-crank generator positioned in the tower basement. The basement was filled with ammunition crates and refugees who had taken shelter from the shelling. The runner, a 19-year-old private, had to shove his way through the crowd. He reached the generator. He grabbed the handle. He cranked. The generator spun. The needle climbed. He reached voltage. He stopped cranking and waited. The delay was intentional. The blasting caps had a built-in timer to give the operator time to escape. The private waited 5 seconds, 10 seconds, 15. Nothing happened. The charges in the eastern tower had failed to detonate. Later, engineers would discover why. The electrical detonation system had been sabotaged, not by Allied agents, not by partisans, by German forced laborers. The bridge had been maintained by a work detail of foreign conscripts, Poles and Russians and Czechs. They knew that if the bridge stood, the Americans would cross. If the Americans crossed, the war would end faster. Someone, maybe one person, maybe a group, had quietly disconnected the blasting caps from the detonator wires. They had done it carefully, leaving the wires intact so the sabotage wouldn't be noticed during inspections. When Bradge twisted the key, when the private cranked the generator, the current flowed through the wire and stopped at empty terminals. The charges never received the signal. The bridge never fell. Sergeant Drabik reached the eastern end of the bridge at 3:59, 2 minutes after he started running. He hit the ground, rolled behind a concrete barrier, and looked back. The bridge was swarming with American infantry. Dozens of soldiers were crossing, running through the smoke and the mortar fire. The Shermans were still on the western bank, too heavy to risk the damaged deck, but the infantry were across. Drabik stood up and started moving inland. His objective was the tunnel. The eastern end of the bridge led directly into a railroad tunnel cut through the hillside. The Germans were using the tunnel as a defensive position. They had machine guns set up inside, firing out at the bridge. Drabeck tossed a grenade into the tunnel mouth. The explosion echoed through the passage. The machine gun went silent. He entered the tunnel, rifle up, moving fast. Inside, it was dark, filled with smoke and the smell of cordite. He could hear German voices shouting. He fired 3 rounds into the darkness. The voices stopped. Behind him, the rest of A Company was clearing the tunnel. They were capturing German soldiers who surrendered, shooting the ones who resisted. Within 10 minutes, the eastern end of the bridge was secure. Lieutenant Timmerman radioed back to General Hoge. "We're across. Bridgehead established." On the western bank, Hoge didn't celebrate. He immediately ordered reinforcements. He knew the Germans would counterattack. He knew they would try to destroy the bridge with artillery, with bombers, with anything they could throw at it. The race was on. Could the Americans expand the bridgehead fast enough to hold it? Could engineers repair the bridge fast enough to get tanks across? And could they do it before the Germans destroyed the only crossing over the Rhine? The news of the intact bridge reached Hitler's headquarters at 11:30 that night. The Führer was in Berlin, living in the bunker beneath the Reich Chancellery. He was conducting the war from a reinforced concrete tomb surrounded by maps that bore no resemblance to reality. When Field Marshal Keitel informed him that the Americans had captured the Ludendorff Bridge, Hitler's reaction was not strategic analysis. It was rage. He screamed at Keitel. He demanded to know how a bridge could still be standing when every bridge was supposed to be destroyed. He demanded names. He wanted to know who was responsible. Keitel gave him names. Captain Bratke, Major Scheller, the regional commander, General von Bothmer, the corps commander. Hitler didn't ask for details. He didn't ask about the sabotage or the failed detonators. He issued an order: court-martial, immediate execution. Within 72 hours, 4 German officers were arrested and tried by a military tribunal. The trial lasted less than an hour. The verdict was predetermined. All 4 were found guilty of dereliction of duty. 3 were sentenced to death by firing squad. They were executed on March 13th, 6 days after the bridge was captured. The 4th officer, Captain Bradge, was sentenced to death but escaped execution when his guards abandoned their posts during the collapse of the German front. He survived the war and spent the rest of his life explaining what happened at Remagen. On the American side, General Hoge was dealing with a different problem. He had infantry across the river, but he needed armor. The bridge deck was damaged. The engineers estimated it could support the weight of a jeep, maybe a light truck. A Sherman tank weighed 30 tons. If the bridge collapsed with a tank on it, the entire crossing would be blocked. Hoge made a decision. He ordered the engineers to start repairs immediately, but he also told them to find every boat, every raft, every piece of floating equipment they could scavenge. If the bridge fell, they would cross by water. The engineers went to work. They brought up timber, steel plates, welding equipment. They started patching the holes in the deck. They worked under fire. German artillery on the eastern hills was shelling the bridge continuously. Mortar rounds were landing in the water. Machine gun fire was raking the deck. The engineers ignored it. They were combat engineers, men who had built Bailey bridges under fire in Normandy, who had cleared minefields in the Ardennes. They knew how to work while people were trying to kill them. By midnight on March 7th, they had patched enough holes to risk a light vehicle. A jeep crossed successfully. By dawn on March 8th, they had reinforced the deck enough to risk a tank. The first Sherman to cross was commanded by Lieutenant John Grimball. He drove slowly, watching the steel groan under the weight. The bridge held. Behind him, more tanks started crossing. By noon on March 8th, the Americans had an entire armored battalion across the Rhine. The Germans were in chaos. Field Marshal Model, commander of Army Group B, was trying to organize a counterattack, but he didn't have a counterattack force. His reserves had been destroyed in the Battle of the Bulge. His divisions were under strength, scattered and retreating. He scraped together what he could. He sent the 11th Panzer Division toward Remagen. The 11th Panzer was a division in name only. It had 20 operational tanks. It had no fuel. It had no air cover. It reached the outskirts of Remagen on March 9th and was immediately shredded by American artillery and airstrikes. Model then tried artillery. He positioned every available gun in range of the bridge and started shelling. The barrage was constant. High explosive shells rained down on the span. The engineers kept working. They patched holes. They replaced steel plates. They welded supports. The bridge stayed up. On March 10th, Hitler ordered the Luftwaffe to destroy the bridge. This was the death throes of the German Air Force. The Luftwaffe, in March 1945, was a shadow of the armada that had terrorized Europe in 1940. Jet fighters, the Me-262s, tried to strafe the bridge. They were fast, faster than any Allied fighter. But they were also low on fuel, low on ammunition, and flown by inexperienced pilots. The American anti-aircraft guns shot them down. The Luftwaffe tried bombers. They sent Arado R-234s, twin-engine attack planes, to dive bomb the bridge. The American fighters intercepted them. Out of a dozen bombers, only 2 reached Remagen. Both missed. Their bombs landed in the river. On March 11th, the Germans tried a weapon that was so desperate it bordered on science fiction. They deployed frogmen. These were German naval commandos equipped with diving suits and limpet mines. The plan was simple: swim downriver to the bridge, attach magnetic mines to the support pillars, detonate the charges, and bring down the span. 7 frogmen entered the water at midnight. The Rhine in March is cold, just above freezing. The current is fast, running at 6 miles per hour. The frogmen were wearing dry suits and carrying mines that weighed 40 pounds each. They were supposed to swim 3 miles in the dark, plant their explosives, and escape. It was suicide. 5 of the 7 frogmen were swept away by the current or died of hypothermia. 1 was captured by American sentries before he reached the bridge. 1, a petty officer named Paul Sauer, actually reached the bridge. He attached his mine to the base of the western tower. He set the timer for 30 minutes. He swam back upstream, fighting the current, and collapsed on the eastern bank. At 1:15 in the morning, the mine detonated. The explosion blew a hole in the stone foundation. The tower shook. The bridge groaned, but it didn't fall. American engineers examined the damage the next morning and decided the structure was still sound. They added more supports. The bridge held. By March 13th, the Americans had 8,000 men and 50 tanks across the Rhine. The bridgehead was expanding. Combat engineers were building additional crossing points. Pontoon bridges were being assembled upstream and downstream from Remagen. The Germans kept trying to destroy the Ludendorff Bridge, but it had become irrelevant. The Americans didn't need it anymore. They had established multiple crossings. The Rhine was no longer a barrier. On March 17th, 10 days after Sergeant Drabik made his run across the span, the bridge finally gave up. It had been hit by artillery, by bombs, by mines. It had supported the weight of thousands of tons of vehicles and equipment. The steel was fatigued. The structure was cracked. At 3 o'clock in the afternoon, engineers were working on the deck when they heard a sound like a gunshot. It was a support beam snapping. They started running. The bridge began to collapse. It didn't fall all at once. It sagged in the middle, slowly at first, then faster. The central arch buckled, the deck tilted, The towers held, but the span between them dropped into the river. The collapse took less than 10 seconds. 28 engineers were on the bridge. 18 made it to shore. 10 went into the water. 3 drowned. The rest were pulled out by rescue teams. The Ludendorff Bridge, the bridge that refused to fall when it mattered, finally fell when it didn't matter anymore. The Americans didn't care. By the time the bridge collapsed, they had 3 pontoon bridges operational. Tanks were rolling across the Rhine in a steady stream. The bridgehead was 15 miles wide and 10 miles deep. The Germans had lost the Rhine, and with it, they had lost the war. The impact of the capture of the bridge at Remagen cannot be overstated. Before March 7th, the Allied plan was to launch a massive assault crossing of the Rhine in late March. This operation, codenamed Operation Plunder, was going to be the largest amphibious assault since D-Day. It would involve airborne drops, naval bombardment, smoke screens, and thousands of landing craft. It was scheduled for March 23rd. The capture of the Remagen Bridge made it unnecessary. The Americans were already across. They had a bridgehead. They had armor. They had momentum. Field Marshal Montgomery's elaborate crossing plan in the north still went forward, but it was an anticlimactic sideshow. The Americans at Remagen had stolen the thunder. More importantly, the bridge forced the Germans to commit their last reserves in the wrong place. Hitler had been hoarding his remaining panzer divisions in the north, expecting the main Allied thrust to come across the flat terrain near Wesel. When the Americans crossed at Remagen, Hitler panicked. He sent his reserves south to contain the bridgehead. Those divisions were shredded by American air power and artillery. By the time Montgomery launched Operation Plunder, there was almost nothing left to oppose him. The German army was broken. The war would last another 7 weeks, but the outcome was no longer in doubt. Back in Remagen, Sergeant Alex Drabick became a minor celebrity. He was officially credited as the first American soldier to cross the Rhine. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross. Reporters interviewed him. His picture appeared in newspapers across the United States. Drabick didn't enjoy the attention. He was a quiet man who had done what he was ordered to do. When asked about his run across the bridge, he said, "I was just trying not to get shot." That was the truth. Lieutenant Carl Timmerman was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross as well. He was promoted to captain. He survived the war and returned to Nebraska, where he worked as a teacher. He rarely talked about Remagen. When students asked him what it was like, he said, "Scary as hell." He died in 1951 at the age of 29 from a brain tumor, possibly caused by stress and exposure during the war. Captain Willy Bratke, the German engineer who tried to blow the bridge, survived the war and spent decades defending his actions. He wrote a memoir explaining the sabotage, the failed detonators, the chaos of the retreat. He was bitter about the execution of his fellow officers. He argued that they had been scapegoats, punished for a failure that was beyond their control. He was right. The trial that sentenced them to death was a farce, ordered by a dictator looking for someone to blame for the collapse of his empire. Bratke died in 1981, still haunted by the events of March 7, 1945. The Ludendorff Bridge was never rebuilt. After the collapse, the Americans decided it wasn't worth the effort. The stone towers on both banks still stand today. They've been converted into a museum, the Peace Museum Bridge at Remagen. You can walk through the towers and see the demolition chambers, the empty voids where the explosives were supposed to be. You can see photographs of the bridge, of the soldiers who crossed it, of the chaos of March 7th. The museum doesn't glorify war, it focuses on the human cost. There's a plaque listing the names of the 10 American engineers who died when the bridge collapsed. There's another plaque listing the names of the 4 German officers who were executed. The bridge is gone, but the memory remains. The story of Remagen is often told as a tale of American bravery. And it was brave. The men who ran across that bridge under fire, knowing it could be blown at any second, showed extraordinary courage. But the story is more than that. It's a story about the collapse of discipline. By March 1945, the German military was no longer a professional force. It was a mob of teenagers and old men held together by terror. The execution of officers for losing a bridge was a symptom of desperation. The real collapse wasn't the bridge. It was the command structure. It was the breakdown of logistics, of communication, of morale. The men defending the bridge weren't elite troops. They were conscripts who didn't want to die for a regime that was already dead. And it's a story about sabotage. The bridge stood because someone, some forced laborer whose name we'll never know, took a risk. They disconnected a wire. They loosened a connection. They performed an act of resistance so subtle that it wasn't discovered until after the bridge had been captured. That person, or those people, changed history. They saved lives. They shortened the war. And they did it knowing that if they were caught, they would be executed. Let's talk about the technical side of the demolition failure, because this is where the story gets interesting from an engineering perspective. The Germans had invested heavily in bridge demolition technology. They understood that bridges were strategic choke points. Lose a bridge, lose the ability to retreat or reinforce, so they designed redundant systems. The Ludendorff Bridge had 3 layers of explosives. Layer 1 was the main demolition chambers in the towers. These were massive charges, hundreds of pounds of TNT packed into voids cut into the stone. The idea was that if these detonated, the towers would collapse inward, severing the bridge at the foundation. The charges were connected to an electrical detonator in the command post. This was a battery-powered system. You turned a key, current flowed through insulated wire to blasting caps embedded in the TNT, and the caps ignited the main charge. The system was tested regularly. Layer 2 was the primer cord. This was a fast-burning explosive cord, essentially a rope filled with PETN, a high explosive. The primer cord was strung along the deck and the support beams. If the main charges failed, you could light the primer cord manually. It would burn through steel in seconds, cutting the bridge apart like a blowtorch. Layer 3 was individual demolition packages. These were TNT blocks bolted to critical structural points on the arch. They were small charges meant to weaken the structure so that the weight of the bridge would collapse it. Each of these systems was supposed to be independent. If one failed, the others should have worked. So why did all 3 fail? The main charges failed because of sabotage. The forced laborers had access to the demolition chambers during maintenance. They disconnected the blasting caps from the detonator wire. But they did it carefully. They left the wires intact so that during inspections, the system appeared functional. When you tested the circuit with a voltmeter, you got a reading. It looked like everything was connected, but the caps were not receiving current. The caps were just sitting there, dead. The primer cord partially succeeded. When Captain Bradge cranked the hand generator, the primer cord on the western side of the bridge detonated, but the primer cord on the eastern side did not. Why? Because the circuit was incomplete. The primer cord was connected in a series. If one section failed to detonate, the burn would stop. Investigators later found that a section of the primer cord near the eastern tower had been cut and poorly reconnected. It might have been accidental, damage from shell fragments during earlier Allied bombing raids, or it might have been intentional, another act of sabotage. Either way, the burn stopped before it reached the eastern demolition chambers. The individual TNT packages on the arch did not detonate at all. These were supposed to be triggered by the main charges. When the main charges failed, The individual packages just sat there. After the bridge was captured, American engineers defused over 300 pounds of explosives that were still attached to the structure. The failure of the demolition system was not unique to Remagen. It was a pattern. Across Germany in the final months of the war, bridges were failing to blow. The Germans would set the charges, turn the key, and nothing would happen. Sometimes it was sabotage. Sometimes it was faulty equipment. The blasting caps were manufactured in factories staffed by forced laborers who had every reason to produce defective products. The detonator wire was often scavenged from damaged telephone lines. The insulation was cracked. Moisture got into the circuits. The batteries were old, drained, barely functional, and the men responsible for the demolitions were not engineers. By March 1945, the professional sappers were dead. The men handling the explosives were replacements, conscripts who had been trained in a 3-day course. They knew the theory. They knew you were supposed to connect the wire to the cap and turn the key. But they didn't understand troubleshooting. When the system failed, they didn't know how to fix it. The result was chaos. Bridges that should have been destroyed were captured intact. The Allies crossed the Rhine at Remagen, at Oppenheim, at Wesel. Each time, the Germans tried to blow the bridges. Each time, something went wrong. Let's return to the bridge itself. The decision to cross it was controversial even within the American command. Some officers argued it was too risky. The bridge was damaged. It could collapse at any moment. And even if it held, the far bank was still controlled by the Germans. Sending troops across was sending them into a trap. But General Hoge understood something that the cautious officers didn't. War is about momentum. The Germans were collapsing. They were retreating. They were disorganized. If you gave them time to regroup, they would set up new defensive lines, bring up reinforcements, and turn the Rhine into a killing ground. But if you hit them now, while they were off balance, you could shatter them. The bridge at Remagen was an opportunity. It was a gamble. But Hoge took the gamble, and it paid off. By the time the Germans realized what had happened, the Americans had thousands of men across the river. The bridgehead was expanding faster than the Germans could contain it. And once the bridgehead was established, the psychological impact was devastating. The Rhine was supposed to be impassable. The German propaganda machine had been telling the soldiers and the civilians that the Rhine was the last line of defense. If the Allies crossed the Rhine, Germany would fight on. The rivers and the forests and the cities would become fortresses. But when the Americans crossed at Remagen, that narrative collapsed. The soldiers defending the eastern bank saw American tanks rolling across the bridge, and they realized the war was over. Thousands of German soldiers surrendered rather than fight. The myth of the impregnable Rhine was broken by a bridge that refused to fall. The German response to the loss of the bridge was a case study in dysfunction. Hitler's immediate reaction was to blame individuals rather than systemic failures. He ordered the execution of the officers, but he didn't ask why the demolition system failed. He didn't investigate the sabotage. He didn't question the decision to use forced labor in critical infrastructure. He was so disconnected from reality that he believed the loss of one bridge was the result of treason rather than the collapse of an entire military machine. Field Marshal Model, who was actually in the field, understood the problem. He sent a report to Berlin explaining that the bridge was lost because the German army no longer had the resources to defend it. He explained that the demolition failed because the equipment was faulty and the personnel were untrained. He requested reinforcements, fuel, ammunition. Hitler's response was to send him a reprimand for defeatism. Model gave up trying to communicate with Berlin. He focused on slowing the American advance. He succeeded for a few days. His units fought desperate, delaying actions, burning villages, destroying roads, setting up ambushes. but the momentum was against him. By the end of March, Army Group B was surrounded in the Ruhr pocket. Model ordered his men to surrender. Then he walked into the forest and shot himself. He was one of the last of the professional German officers, a man who had fought on the Eastern Front, in France, in Belgium. He understood military reality, and when that reality became unbearable, he chose death. The American exploitation of the bridgehead was methodical. Once the initial crossing was secured, the engineers moved in. They didn't just repair the Ludendorff Bridge, they built multiple crossing points. Pontoon bridges went up at Linz, at Honnef, at Bad Godesberg. The Rhine became a highway. Within 2 weeks, the Americans had 7 divisions across the river. The logistics were staggering. Each division required 500 tons of supplies per day. Ammunition, fuel, food, medical supplies. The engineers built roads. They set up supply dumps. They cleared minefields. They repaired rail lines. The bridgehead transformed from a tenuous foothold into a massive supply base. And from that base, the Americans launched the final offensive into the heart of Germany. The breakout from Remagen didn't follow the pre-war plans. The original strategy had been to cross the Rhine in the north, wheel east toward Berlin. The Russians were advancing from the east. The two armies would meet, trap the Germans, end the war. But Remagen changed the geometry. The Americans now had a southern route. They drove east into the Ruhr, Germany's industrial heartland. They cut off Army Group B. They captured hundreds of thousands of prisoners, and they kept driving. By April, American units were crossing the Elbe River. They were less than 100 miles from Berlin. The decision to halt at the Elbe to let the Russians take Berlin was political. But the military victory was already secured. The Germans had no reserves. They had no fuel. They had no air force. The war was over in everything but name. Let's talk about the human cost. The capture of the bridge at Remagen is often presented as a bloodless victory. One bridge, one day, minimal casualties. That's not accurate. The fighting around Remagen lasted for weeks. The Americans suffered approximately 300 casualties capturing and holding the bridgehead. That includes the 10 engineers who died when the bridge collapsed. The Germans lost thousands. Many were killed in the fighting. Many more were captured. The exact numbers are unclear because the German units were disintegrating. Men were deserting, surrendering, or just disappearing into the civilian population, and the civilians suffered. Remagen was shelled continuously. The town was bombed by the Luftwaffe trying to destroy the bridge. Dozens of civilians died. Hundreds were displaced. The war came to Remagen, and it came hard. The museum at the bridge towers has a section dedicated to the civilian experience. There are photographs of destroyed homes, of families huddled in cellars, of children digging through rubble. War is not a game played on a map. It's a disaster that destroys lives. The people of Remagen didn't ask to be the focal point of the final campaign in Europe. They just happened to live in a town with a bridge. The story of Remagen raises a question that's uncomfortable for historians. How much of the Allied victory was due to competence, and how much was due to enemy failure? The Americans didn't capture the bridge because they executed a brilliant plan. They captured it because the Germans failed to destroy it. And the Germans failed because their demolition system was sabotaged, their equipment was faulty, and their command structure was collapsing. If the blasting caps had been connected properly, if the primer cord had burned through, if Captain Bradge had detonated the charges 30 seconds earlier, the bridge would have fallen. The Americans would have been forced to stage an amphibious assault. The war might have lasted another month. Thousands more people would have died. The margin between victory and defeat, between success and disaster, was a disconnected wire. It's tempting to attribute great events to great decisions, to believe that wars are won by brilliant generals and heroic soldiers. And there's truth to that. The men who crossed the bridge were brave. The commanders who ordered the crossing were decisive. But luck played a role. Sabotage played a role. Entropy played a role. The Germans lost at Remagen, not because the Americans were perfect, but because the Germans were broken. Let me tell you about the aftermath for the soldiers involved. Sergeant Alex Drabik, the first man across, returned to the United States a hero. But heroes don't always have happy endings. Drabik struggled with what we now call PTSD. He had nightmares. He drank. He couldn't hold a job. He moved from town to town, trying to escape the memories. He died in 1993 at the age of 71, largely forgotten. The last interview he gave, he said, "I didn't feel like a hero. I felt like a guy who got lucky." Lieutenant Carl Timmerman's story is even more tragic. After the war, he married, started a family, became a teacher. But he suffered from severe headaches, blackouts. In 1951, he collapsed in his classroom. He was diagnosed with a brain tumor. The doctors said it was inoperable. He died a few weeks later. His widow believed the tumor was caused by the stress of combat, the months of constant shelling and fighting. There's no way to prove that, but the correlation is striking. Timmerman was 29. He had survived the war, but the war killed him anyway. Captain Willy Bratke lived longer, but his life was defined by March 7, 1945. He wrote a book, Bridge at Remagen, trying to explain what happened. He corresponded with historians. He gave interviews. He was obsessed with proving that he had done everything he could, that the failure was not his fault. He was right. But it didn't change the fact that 4 of his fellow officers were executed because Hitler needed someone to blame. Bratke carried that guilt until he died. The bridge at Remagen became a symbol. For the Americans, it represented the ingenuity and the audacity that characterized their way of war. The plan said to wait for the big operation. The soldiers saw an opportunity and took it. That's the American narrative. For the Germans, it represented the collapse of discipline and the cost of totalitarianism. The bridge failed to blow not because of bad luck, but because the regime had alienated the people who built and maintained its infrastructure. The forced laborers sabotaged the demolitions because they wanted the war to end. They knew the Nazis were going to lose. They were just accelerating the inevitable. That sabotage saved lives, shortened the war, and changed history. And we don't even know their names. That's the tragedy. We know the names of the generals, the politicians, the medal recipients. We don't know the names of the people who quietly resisted, who took small risks that had enormous consequences. Somewhere in a forgotten corner of a cemetery in Germany or Poland or Russia, there's a grave of someone who disconnected a wire on the Ludendorff Bridge. That person is as responsible for ending the war as Eisenhower or Patton, but we'll never know who they were. Let's talk about the engineering lessons. The failure of the Ludendorff Bridge demolition led to a complete overhaul of military demolition procedures. After the war, the U.S. Army engineers studied what went wrong. They interviewed German engineers. They examined the demolition systems. They wrote new manuals. The lessons were clear. First, redundancy is not enough if all the redundant systems share a common failure point. The bridge had 3 demolition systems, but they all relied on the same electrical infrastructure. If that infrastructure was compromised, all 3 systems failed. The new doctrine required independent systems with separate power sources, separate detonators, and separate personnel. Second, forced labor cannot be trusted in critical roles. This sounds obvious in hindsight, but in 1945, the Germans were using forced laborers everywhere. They were building V-2 rockets. They were maintaining bridges. They were working in munitions factories, and all of them were sabotaging their work. The new Allied doctrine required that any critical task be performed by trusted personnel who had a stake in the success of the mission. Third, equipment maintenance matters. The German demolition systems failed because the equipment was old, poorly maintained, and stored in damp conditions. Blasting caps corrode, wires degrade, batteries die. If you're going to rely on a demolition system, you need to test it regularly, replace components, and ensure that when you turn the key, it works. These lessons were applied in Korea, in Vietnam, in the Gulf War. Every time American engineers rig a bridge for demolition, they're following procedures that were written in response to the failure at Remagen. The cultural impact of Remagen was significant. In 1969, a Hollywood film was released, The Bridge at Remagen, starring George Segal and Robert Vaughn. The film took significant liberties with the historical facts. It depicted the bridge as a massive fortification defended by elite German troops. It added fictional characters and invented dramatic confrontations, but it captured the essence of the story. A small group of men doing something desperate and dangerous because it was the only option. The film was a modest success. It didn't win Oscars, but it became a staple of late-night television. A generation of Americans grew up watching it, learning about the bridge. The real story, the story of the sabotage and the incompetence and the chaos, was less cinematic, but it was more important, because the real story is a reminder that war is not clean. Victory is not inevitable. And sometimes the deciding factor is not the generals or the soldiers, but the anonymous people who resist in small ways. Now, let's discuss the strategic implications. The capture of the Remagen Bridge forced the German High Command to make a catastrophic decision. They had to commit their last mobile reserves to contain the bridgehead. This meant stripping units from other sectors. It meant sending panzer divisions south when they should have been defending against Montgomery's crossing in the north. It meant dispersing their forces instead of concentrating them. The result was predictable. The Germans were too weak everywhere. When Montgomery launched Operation Plunder on March 23rd, he faced minimal resistance. The Rhine crossings in the north, which had been expected to be bloody and difficult, were almost unopposed. The Germans had gambled everything on stopping the Americans at Remagen, and they lost. By the end of March, the Allies had established bridgeheads across the entire length of the Rhine, from Switzerland to the North Sea. The river that was supposed to be Germany's last line of defense had been breached in a dozen places. The German army was cut off, surrounded, collapsing. There was no longer any possibility of holding the line, of negotiating a peace, of surviving. The war would last another 6 weeks, but only because it took time for the Allied armies to physically occupy all of Germany. One of the lesser-known aspects of the Remagen story is the role of intelligence. The Americans knew the bridge existed. They had aerial reconnaissance photographs, but they didn't know it was still standing until the reconnaissance plane spotted it on March 7th. This raises the question, why didn't the Germans destroy the bridge earlier? The answer is complex. The German military was operating under contradictory orders. On one hand, Hitler had issued a directive to destroy all bridges to prevent them from being captured. On the other hand, the Wehrmacht needed the bridges to retreat. Thousands of German soldiers were still west of the Rhine, trying to escape encirclement. If the bridges were blown prematurely, those soldiers would be trapped. The local commanders were caught in an impossible situation. Blow the bridge too early, and you abandon your own men. Blow it too late, and the enemy captures it. Captain Bradge received his orders to blow the bridge the moment the enemy appears. But what did that mean? When the Americans were 10 miles away, 1 mile, in sight of the bridge? Bradge waited until the last possible moment, hoping to save the retreating German soldiers. By the time he tried to blow the bridge, it was too late. The Americans were already there, The failure at Remagen was compounded by the failure of communication. The German command structure in March 1945 was a disaster. Orders were being issued from Berlin that had no connection to reality. Field commanders were receiving conflicting directives. Radio networks were jammed or destroyed. Messengers were being killed or captured. The result was paralysis. Nobody knew what was happening. Nobody knew what they were supposed to do. Bratje didn't have clear orders. He had a vague directive and no support. When he tried to report the capture of the bridge, he couldn't get through. The telephone lines were cut. The radio was out. He sent a runner, but the runner was killed by American artillery. By the time Berlin learned what had happened, the Americans had already consolidated the bridgehead. The lack of communication meant that even if the Germans had wanted to launch an immediate counterattack, they couldn't coordinate it. Units were scattered. Nobody knew where anybody else was. The Germans lost the bridge not because of one failure, but because of a cascading series of failures that started with the collapse of their command and control system. Let's talk about the role of the weather. March in Germany is unpredictable. It can be cold, rainy, foggy. On March 7th, the weather was overcast with low clouds. This worked in the Americans' favor. The Luftwaffe couldn't fly effective reconnaissance or bombing missions. The Germans couldn't see the American forces massing west of Remagen. The fog rolling off the Rhine provided cover for the initial assault. If the weather had been clear, if the Germans had been able to see the American column approaching, they might have blown the bridge earlier. Or they might have reinforced the defenses. The weather also affected the demolition. The primer cord and the electrical wires were exposed to moisture. The blasting caps were sensitive to damp conditions. It's possible that some of the failures were due to water infiltration into the electrical circuits. The engineers who examined the bridge after the capture found evidence of corrosion on the wiring. This wasn't just sabotage, it was also entropy. The bridge had been rigged for demolition weeks earlier. The equipment had been sitting in the weather, degrading, rusting. By the time Bratje tried to blow it, the system was compromised. The American exploitation of the bridgehead showcased the difference between the two armies. The Americans were flexible. When they saw an opportunity, they took it. They didn't wait for permission from higher command. General Hoge made the decision to seize the bridge. He radioed his superiors and told them what he was doing, but he didn't wait for approval. This kind of decentralized decision-making was built into American doctrine. Commanders at every level were empowered to take initiative. The Germans, by contrast, were paralyzed by a rigid command structure. Bratje couldn't make a decision without orders from above. When the orders didn't come, or when they came too late, he was helpless. This difference in command philosophy was one of the reasons the Americans won the war. They were faster, more adaptable, more willing to take risks. The Germans were stuck following a playbook written by a dictator who was disconnected from reality. And when the playbook failed, they didn't know what to do. The legacy of Remagen lives on in military doctrine. The concept of seizing an intact bridge, of exploiting enemy mistakes, is now a standard part of American military training. Officers study the battle. They analyze the decisions. They learn that in war, you don't wait for perfect conditions. You act when the opportunity presents itself. The bridge at Remagen was an opportunity that shouldn't have existed. It existed because the Germans made mistakes. The Americans took advantage of those mistakes. That's what separates winners from losers in war. It's not about being perfect. It's about being less imperfect than your enemy. The Germans were falling apart in March 1945. The Americans were tired, stretched thin, operating at the end of a long supply line. But they were still functional. They could still make decisions, still execute plans, still adapt to changing circumstances. The Germans couldn't. That's why the Americans won. That's why the bridge at Remagen became a symbol of the endgame of the war in Europe. Let me tell you about one more person. There was an American photographer named Tony Vaccaro who was embedded with the troops at Remagen. He took hundreds of photographs of the bridge, the soldiers, the crossing. His photographs are now in the Library of Congress. They're raw, unfiltered images of war. Men running across the bridge under fire. Engineers working on the deck while shells explode in the water. Medics treating wounded soldiers. Vaccaro's photographs captured something that the official reports didn't. They captured the fear, the exhaustion, the chaos. One photograph shows a soldier sitting on the eastern bank after the crossing. He's leaning against a tree, helmet off, face covered in mud. He's smoking a cigarette, staring at nothing. That image is the reality of war. It's not heroic. It's not glorious. It's just a guy who survived something terrible and doesn't know how to process it. Vaccaro's work is a reminder that behind every historical event, there are individuals, real people with names and families and fears. The bridge at Remagen was captured by 8,000 men, but it was experienced by 8,000 individuals, each with their own story. The German civilians in Remagen had their own experience. They had been living under bombardment for months. Allied planes had been bombing the rail yards, the bridges, the roads. By March, the town was half destroyed. The civilians were living in cellars, surviving on rations, waiting for the end. When the Americans arrived, there was no resistance from the civilians. They were relieved. The war was over for them, but the first days of occupation were chaotic. American soldiers were searching for German troops, clearing buildings, securing the area. There were firefights in the streets. Artillery was still falling on the town. The civilians were caught in the middle. Some were killed by friendly fire. Some were killed by retreating German soldiers who accused them of collaborating with the enemy. The Americans set up a military government, distributed food, established order. But the trauma of those days left scars. The people of Remagen spent decades rebuilding. The town recovered, but the memory of March 1945 never faded. That's why they built the museum. Not to celebrate war, but to remember what it cost. Let's return to the technical failure of the demolition one last time. The more you study the details, the more you realize how fragile the German demolition plan was. It wasn't just one thing that went wrong. It was multiple things. The sabotage, the faulty equipment, the rushed timeline, the chaos of the retreat, the lack of trained personnel, the weather, the conflicting orders. Any one of these factors might have been overcome. But when they all happened simultaneously, the system collapsed. This is a lesson that applies beyond military operations. Any complex system is vulnerable to cascading failures. You can have redundancy, you can have backup plans, but if the underlying conditions are deteriorating, if the people operating the system are unreliable or untrained, if the equipment is failing, then eventually the system will break. The bridge at Remagen broke, and when it broke, it changed the course of history. The post-war analysis of the battle identified several critical moments. The first was General Hoge's decision to divert his column toward Remagen. He didn't have orders to go there. He made a command decision based on sketchy intelligence. If he had followed his original orders, the bridge would have been destroyed before the Americans arrived. The second critical moment was Lieutenant Timmerman's decision to cross the bridge immediately. He didn't wait for engineers to inspect it. He didn't wait for air cover. He just went. That decision saved the bridge. If he had waited, the Germans would have had time for a second demolition attempt. The third critical moment was the sabotage. We don't know who did it or when, but someone at some point disconnected those blasting caps. That unknown person's decision was as important as any general's order. And the fourth critical moment was the collapse of the bridge 10 days later. If the bridge had collapsed with American troops on it during the initial crossing, the entire operation would have been a disaster. But it held just long enough. That's not strategy, that's luck. The story of Remagen is taught in military academies around the world. It's a case study in opportunistic warfare, but it's also a case study in the fog of war, the chaos, the confusion, the mistakes that define real combat. There's a tendency in military history to sanitize battles, to present them as chess games where generals move pieces and outcomes are determined by superior strategy. Remagen wasn't like that. Remagen was a mess. Plans fell apart. Equipment failed. People panicked. And in the middle of that chaos, a few individuals made decisions that happened to work out. That's the reality of war. It's not clean. It's not predictable. And the difference between victory and defeat is often a matter of inches, of seconds, of a wire that wasn't connected. If you found this story compelling, if you believe that the real history of war is in the details, in the human decisions and the mechanical failures, then do me a favor. Hit that like button. It helps the algorithm show this video to more people who care about these forgotten moments. And make sure you're subscribed. We're digging through the archives every week, finding the stories that changed history, the battles that were decided by mechanics and engineers and anonymous acts of resistance. Drop a comment below. Tell us, have you ever heard of the bridge at Remagen? Did you know this story? What other moments from World War II do you want us to cover? We read every comment. Thank you for watching. Thank you for being part of this community. We're here to make sure these stories, these lessons, don't disappear into silence. The bridge at Remagen fell on March 17, 1945. But the story of what happened on March 7th, the story of the bridge that refused to fall when it mattered most, that story will never fall. It's preserved here, in this video, in the memories of the people who lived it, and in the lessons we carry forward. War is hell, but the stories of the people who survive it, who endure it, who resist it in small ways, those stories are what keep us human. That's why we do this. That's why these videos matter. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next one.